It wasn't a healthy relationship.
Love is the most beautiful thing in the world, and when you're in love with someone, you think that they can do nothing wrong. But what happens if what they do is something really unimaginable? This is the tragic story of Penny Clough, the woman who was killed by her husband from hell, and this is what happened. Penny Clough was born and raised in Nelson, Lancashire, in northern England. She was the first child of her parents, John and Penny Clough. Growing up, Jane was described as thoughtful, nurturing, and kind of girl that made her parents very proud. She was super smart and talented, and did very well in school. Because of her outgoing, warm, and bubbly personality, she had many friends, and everyone really liked her. From a young age, Jane always knew what she wanted to do with her life. She had grown up seeing her mom, who was a nurse, helping and taking care of others, and she wanted to be just like her. So she worked hard in school, passed all her tests with flying colors, and in 2017, when she was 22 years old, she was officially qualified to become a nurse. She immediately found the perfect job at Blackpool's Victoria Hospital in the emergency care unit. Here, she made a bunch of new friends who shared her passions and interests. Things were going really well for Jane until this one person entered her life and turned everything upside down. His name was Jonathan Vaz, and he worked as an ambulance technician in the hospital. He was also a bodybuilder who used steroids and worked as a part-time bouncer in a nightclub. Jane really liked him and thought he was kind and caring, and also shared the same passion for nurturing and taking care of others. On the other hand, Jonathan was also developing a crush on Jane, and as time went by, the two started dating. However, they decided to keep their relationship a secret since Jonathan was a private person, and he didn't like everyone knowing his business. But after dating for 4 months, Jane couldn't hide it any longer, and she decided to tell her fellow nurses that she was seeing Jonathan. She wanted them to know the loving, kind, and caring person that Jonathan was, and be happy for her. However, the reaction she got was totally not what she was expecting. Her friends did not see Jonathan the same way that she did. Instead, they saw him as unprofessional, clumsy, rude, and inappropriate. They thought he was weird and lazy, and made inappropriate jokes. Jane didn't get why her friends were not happy for her and were saying all these mean things about Jonathan. So she decided to ignore their opinions since she felt like they didn't know Jonathan as well as she did. She went on with her relationship with him, and they would meet him for coffee, have lunch together, and hang out at bars on the weekend. And every day she fell deeper and deeper in love with him. As the relationship continued to blossom, Jonathan asked Jane to officially be his girlfriend, and Jane happily said yes. But before they became official, Jonathan said that there was something he needed to tell her, and Jane was like, "Yes, tell me." And that's when Jonathan dropped a bombshell that she totally wasn't expecting. He told Jane that he was actually married. Can you believe that? He'd been married for around 2 years and even had 2 young children. You can just imagine the shock on Jane's face. Here's a guy that she thought was absolutely perfect and actually wanted to start a family with, and now she learns that he's been living a double life? She was angry, disappointed, and heartbroken, all at the same time. But Jonathan quickly reassured her that it wasn't as bad as it looked, that he was actually getting a divorce because his wife had been cheating on him. He claimed that the reason the divorce was taking so long was that he didn't want to hurt his kids. That's a classic lie for every cheating man out there, but Jane bought it. She was just way too much in love with him to see beyond his lies, and she even started feeling sorry for him being stuck in such a terrible situation with his wife. So despite his confession, she continued seeing him, hoping that he would finalize his divorce and they could finally start their life together. 10 months into the relationship, Jonathan came in and told her that he was now a free man and that they could now start living together. And Jane happily agreed, not knowing that this would be the beginning of her nightmare. Now, the first time that Jane introduced Jonathan to her family, they actually liked him and thought that he was a good guy. But then they started noticing some small things that made them think that he was not exactly what he portrayed himself to be. He would often tell some white, unnecessary lies that didn't make sense. Like one time he told Jane's parents that he had a super rich grandmother who had left a huge inheritance for him. But the way he lived, it didn't seem like he had that much money. Jonathan was also completely jealous and controlling, and always wanted to to know Jane's whereabouts all the time.
It wasn't a healthy relationship. He was constantly texting her, asking her where she was, who she was with, when will she be back, and it was many, many texts a day.
He would also show up when she went out with friends just to see who was there and if she was where she said she was going. He would lock her up in the house so she couldn't go to work and take away her phone so she couldn't contact anyone. As time went on, he started breaking her self-esteem by insulting and humiliating her in front of her family and coworkers. However, Jane kept all of these things from her friends and family, and even hid the fact that Jonathan was also physically abusing her. He slapped her once when they argued about something, but it got increasingly worse with time. Jane continued staying with him because she would feel like she deserved what he did to her. She would wear long sleeves and scarves to work to cover up her bruises. Her friends and family soon started to notice the sudden change in her. She was no longer the happy and vibrant woman that they knew, and they became worried for her. And guys, that's the thing with abusers. They start by crushing your spirit so that whatever they do to you, you feel like it's your fault and you deserve it. But remember guys, they are the ones with the problem and not you. So don't let them gaslight you into believing otherwise. You deserve better, and there's always a way out of that awful situation. Now, in this case, Jane didn't know that while Jonathan was acting all jealous and controlling, he was actually still married and was also seeing another woman at the same time. He managed to dupe Jane by claiming that he had to go to the family home regularly to look after his children, and by inventing night shifts at work. Jane soon got pregnant and was really excited, thinking that now with the baby around, the Jonathan she met and fell in love with would be back and the abuse would stop. But sadly, she was mistaken. Things only got worse, to the point where when she was 7 months pregnant, Jonathan forced himself into her. That's something that he had never done before, and Jane was shocked and felt completely violated. Even with the abuse, she never imagined that he would be capable of doing such a horrible thing to her. But he would do it again and again for weeks until she finally gave birth to her beautiful baby girl in October 2009. And for a while, things seemed to get better at home, and Jane thought that maybe this was what they needed for Jonathan to straighten up. But then just a few weeks after giving birth, Jonathan actually her again, and this time right in front of their daughter. And that was the last straw for Jane. When Jonathan went to work, she packed up her things and her babies and left. But things were far from over. Jane went back to live with her parents and told them everything that had been happening. She thought that she had gotten away from Jonathan and could finally restart her life with her daughter. But Jonathan kept texting her and begging her to come back. He promised to behave and told her that they were going to get married and have more children. Jane, you have hurt and reduced me to tears on countless occasions. And you want to get engaged and have more kids? Why? Jonathan, we are staying together regardless of our problems. Jane, you physically and abuse me. You threatened to kill me the other night. Jonathan, please, can I come home? Best behavior. Promise. Somehow, Jonathan managed to manipulate Jane into believing that he was sorry and would not hurt her again. So Jane went back to him, and they lived for only a few days before he was back to his old ways. This time around, Jane escaped and went to the police to file a complaint against him. Jonathan was soon arrested and charged with assault and rape. He allegedly told one of his colleagues that if he was found guilty, he would kill Jane. The colleague dismissed the threat as some wild talk, but sadly, it wasn't. Jane kept a diary in which she wrote about everything that was going on in her life and her fear that Jonathan was going to get revenge on her. On January 15th, 2010, she wrote, "I'm worried Johnny's going to do something stupid, like try to find me. Time is running out for him. I don't believe he will just sit back and let a jury find him guilty. He's not going to let them send him to prison, and I can't help thinking he will get his revenge on me." Then on March 8th, 2010, Jane wrote, "I've been worrying today about Johnny coming to get me, even killing me if he gets found guilty. When he's released awaiting sentencing, what would stop him?" Jonathan was released on bail, despite protests from the police and the prosecution, who told the judge that given the severity of his crimes with which he had been charged, Jonathan should not be allowed bail. But the judge still released him, saying there was no evidence to show that Jonathan posed a threat to Jane, and that he had no previous criminal record. When word got out that Jonathan had been released, Jane and everyone around her was in a panic mode. Jane lived in constant fear that Jonathan would attack her, and so on the rare occasions that she went, she would be accompanied by friends or family. She kept herself busy by taking care of her daughter, writing in her diary, and despite her fear, she tried to remain positive that Jonathan would soon be in prison and she would be free to live her life. Sadly, this was not to be. On July 23, 2010, Jane decided to go out for a night with friends. They all laughed and had fun, and for the first time in a while, everyone thought Jane was her bubbly and happy self again, and they were all happy for her. They never imagined that it would be the last time they would see their friend alive again. On July 25, 2010, Jane drove to the hospital for her night shift. Normally, she would ask someone to meet her in the car and walk her into the hospital building, but this time she didn't want to bother her coworkers, and so she decided to walk to the hospital alone. As she was walking towards the main gate of the building, Jonathan suddenly jumped out of nowhere and stabbed her repeatedly multiple times before walking casually away. He then stopped, turned around, and went back to where Jane was laying on the ground, severely injured and bleeding profusely, and her throat. When her colleagues found her, they immediately took her to the emergency center and tried everything to save her life, but her injuries were too severe, and she died minutes later. Jane's parents were preparing to go to bed at around midnight when the police knocked on the door and gave them the devastating news. At first, her parents thought that the police had mistaken their daughter for someone else, but then the hospital called and confirmed the news, and they immediately knew that Jonathan was behind it. Someone had witnessed the murder, and from the description they provided, police were sure that Jonathan was the killer, and they were afraid that he might try to harm Jane's parents and kidnap or murder his daughter. Early the next morning, Jonathan was arrested, and when the police searched his car, they found cans of gas that they believe he intended to use to set fire on the house and kill Jane's parents and his 9-month-old daughter. Jonathan pleaded guilty to the murder of Jane and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Jane's devastated parents still believe that their daughter might still be alive today if her killer had not been granted bail. They started a campaign pushing for a change of law that would, in certain circumstances, allow prosecutors to appeal a judge's decision to grant bail. The campaign gathered a lot of support, and in 2012, a change was made to the legal aid, sentencing, and punishment of offenders bill. It became known as Jane's Law, and it aimed to protect domestic violence victims. But Jane's mother said in an interview that it takes more than pieces of paper to protect victims from domestic abuse.
Bits of paper and words from a judge do not protect victims of domestic abuse. What protects victims is real action against the perpetrator to keep the victim safe.
If you liked this case, be sure to check out the next video, which is totally insane.